She was a billionaire who visited her daughter's grave every week. Alone, silent, carrying a grief money could never soften. But that afternoon, she stopped cold. A black driver was kneeling beside the headstone, shoulders shaking, tears falling freely, and a small girl clung to his arm as if he were her only safe place. Fresh flowers she had never brought. A crayon drawing pressed gently against the stone. Her breath caught, because in that single, shattering moment, she realized her daughter had lived a life she never truly knew, and its greatest story was about to be revealed. Margaret Hayes had everything money could buy: private jets, glass towers, a name that opened doors without knocking. But peace was never on the list. Every Tuesday, at the same hour, she walked the familiar path through the cemetery. Same black coat, same measured steps, same ache pressing against her ribs. This was the only place where her wealth meant nothing. That day should have been no different until she saw him. A black driver, dressed in a simple, worn uniform, kneeling beside her daughter's grave. Margaret's heart tightened, then hardened. Who was he? Why was he here? Anger rose before curiosity ever could. "This is my daughter's grave," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the quiet. The man jumped to his feet instantly, his face flushed with panic as he pulled a small girl close, instinctively placing himself between Margaret and the child. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quickly. "We were just leaving." There was no argument, no defense, only the posture of someone who had learned, long ago, how to disappear. Margaret opened her mouth to speak again, but stopped. At the base of the headstone were fresh flowers. Not extravagant, carefully chosen. Beside them lay a folded piece of paper, a child's drawing, colored with effort and love. This wasn't vandalism. This wasn't trespassing. It was care. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. A feeling she hadn't expected at her daughter's grave. Not anger, but questions. "My name is Daniel Foster." His voice was low, careful, like every word had been trained to step softly in the presence of power. Margaret watched him closely as he spoke. His hands trembled just slightly, one resting protectively on the little girl's shoulder. She couldn't have been more than 6. Big eyes, tired eyes, the kind that had seen too much and asked too few questions. "I'm a private driver," he continued. "Long hours, different families. Whoever needs me." There was no bitterness in his tone, just fact. "And this," he said, glancing down, his voice warming in a way Margaret hadn't expected, "is my daughter, Sophie." Sophie looked up at Margaret, cautious but curious, clutching a crumpled piece of paper, the same drawing Margaret had noticed by the headstone. A stick-figure family, a son in the corner, and a woman with long hair and a wide smile, standing between father and child. Margaret swallowed. Daniel took a breath, steadying himself, then nodded toward the grave. "We come here once a month," he said. "Sometimes more, when Sophie asks." Margaret frowned. "Why?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Daniel hesitated. Then he spoke her daughter's name. "Emma." The sound of it hit Margaret like a sudden gust of cold air. He didn't say it formally, didn't say it with distance or obligation. He said it softly, almost reverently, like the name belonged somewhere close to his heart. Margaret hadn't heard anyone say Emma like that in years. "She wasn't just a nurse," Daniel said gently, as if correcting something the world had gotten wrong. "I know that's what the papers wrote, but that wasn't who she was to us." Margaret's chest tightened. "She stayed late," he continued, "long after her shift ended. She said no one should die feeling alone, not if there was something she could do about it." He paused, eyes drifting to the headstone. "When Sophie was sick, really sick, I didn't have insurance that covered everything. I was driving nights, barely sleeping. I thought I was going to lose her." Sophie's fingers tightened around his sleeve. "Emma noticed," Daniel said. "She always noticed things other people missed. She'd sit with Sophie after her rounds, read her stories, bring her coloring pencils. She'd sneak in cookies when the doctors weren't looking." A faint, painful smile crossed his face. "She made Sophie laugh when I couldn't." Margaret felt her knees weaken. She shifted her weight, suddenly kneading the cold stone bench behind her. "She never told me," Margaret whispered. Daniel nodded. She said you were busy. She didn't want to worry you. That sentence broke something open inside Margaret. Busy. That was the word Emma had always used. Mom's busy. She'll come later. She loves me. She's just busy. Daniel went on, his voice thickening. There was an older woman in the ward. No family. No visitors. Everyone said she was difficult. He shook his head slowly. Emma sat with her every night, brushed her hair, held her hand, told her she mattered. He laughed quietly through his tears. She used to say, kindness costs nothing, but it saves everything. Margaret closed her eyes. She had raised her daughter with privilege, education, opportunity. But somewhere along the way, Emma had learned compassion without her. She helped us when she didn't have to, Daniel said. When she died, his voice cracked, and he stopped, pressing his lips together. Sophie stepped closer to him, small arms wrapping around his waist. When she died, he tried again. Sophie cried for days. She kept asking why the lady who read her stories wasn't coming back. Margaret's tears fell freely now. She didn't bother wiping them away. She asked if Emma would be lonely, Daniel said. So we come here. We bring flowers. Sophie draws pictures. She says Emma shouldn't be alone either. The cemetery was silent, except for the wind moving gently through the trees. Margaret looked at the drawing again. It wasn't just a child's scribble. It was gratitude. It was love. It was proof of a life her daughter had lived beyond wealth, beyond headlines, beyond her mother's expectations. I didn't know her, Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. I thought I did, but I didn't. Daniel shook his head slowly. You raised her, he said. The rest she chose. That was when Margaret finally broke. Not the controlled grief of boardrooms and black dresses, but the raw, uncontrollable sorrow of a mother realizing her child had become extraordinary in ways she'd never paused long enough to see. She sank onto the bench, one hand pressed to her mouth, sobbing openly. And for the first time since Emma's death, she didn't feel alone. She felt closer to her daughter than she had in years. Through the voice of a driver, the drawing of a child, and the truth that love leaves echoes far beyond blood. Daniel's voice grew quieter, heavier, as if each word carried a memory he had learned to keep buried. My wife, she had cancer, he said. Late stage. Margaret's breath caught. No insurance, Daniel continued. No family who could help. Doctors gave us numbers I couldn't even read without shaking. And time, he swallowed hard. Time they said we didn't have. He stared at the ground, his shoes pressed into the damp earth near Emma's grave. That's when Emma stepped in. Margaret closed her eyes. She could picture her daughter now, not as the polished woman beside her at charity galas, but as the quiet figure Daniel was describing. She found out my wife was getting worse, Daniel said. I never asked her for anything. I was embarrassed. I was a driver. I didn't think someone like her should even know about our problems. His lips curved into a sad smile. But Emma noticed the exhaustion, the panic, the way I kept checking my phone during shifts. Margaret felt her chest tighten again. She offered to watch Sophie during my night shifts, Daniel went on, just for a few hours at first, so it would help me breathe. He shook his head in disbelief. It helped me survive. Emma, the billionaire's daughter, had been babysitting in silence, while her mother negotiated contracts worth more than Daniel would earn in a lifetime. She brought toys, Daniel said softly, books, little snacks Sophie liked. She'd sit on the floor and read until Sophie fell asleep on her shoulder. Margaret's hands curled into fists. She'd tell Sophie stories, Daniel continued, about brave girls and gentle heroes, about kindness being a kind of strength. A pause, and when my wife was too weak to stand, Emma stayed with her, held her hand, listened to her fears. Daniel's eyes filled with tears again. My wife used to say Emma made her feel human again. Not a burden, not a bill, a person. Margaret felt something tear open inside her chest. She never told me. She whispered again, the words tasting bitter. Daniel nodded. She didn't want you to know. Why? Margaret asked, her voice cracking. Daniel looked at her, truly looked at her this time. Because she never wanted credit, he said simply. She didn't help us to be seen. She helped us because she couldn't walk past pain and ignore it. Margaret pressed her hand to her heart. She paid for some treatments, Daniel added quietly. Left the envelopes where I'd find them. No name, just a note that said, "You're not alone." The cemetery seemed to shrink around them. She was there the night my wife passed, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. She held Sophie while I said goodbye. She stayed until the sun came up. Sophie, who had been silent, suddenly reached into her small backpack. She pulled out a worn, gray stuffed rabbit. One ear was missing. The fur was thinned with age and love. She held it up carefully. "Miss Emma gave me Bunny," Sophie whispered. "She said when people go away, love never goes away." Margaret's control shattered. She covered her face as sobs tore through her chest. Deep, aching cries she hadn't allowed herself since the day Emma died. Her daughter hadn't just been kind. She had been a quiet miracle in lives that never made headlines. And standing there, beside a driver and a little girl, Margaret realized the most painful truth of all. The world had known Emma better than her own mother ever had. Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed by the tears, but he didn't stop them. "We weren't at the funeral," he said quietly. Margaret looked up, startled. "Why not?" Daniel hesitated, then answered with the kind of honesty that carried no accusation, only truth. "We weren't invited." The words landed heavier than anger ever could. "It was family," he continued softly. "People like us don't usually belong in rooms like that." Margaret felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. "I didn't think it mattered," Daniel said. "I thought saying goodbye anywhere would be enough." After the funeral, after the black cars and speeches and carefully chosen words, the world had moved on. But Daniel and Sophie hadn't. "So we came here," he said, gesturing to the grave. This felt like the right place. Margaret's throat tightened. "For 3 years," Daniel continued, "we've come quietly. No one knew. No one asked. Every month. Sometimes every week. When Sophie learned to save her allowance, she bought flowers herself," he said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "Cheap ones. But she chose them carefully." Margaret looked down at the bouquet again. Simple. Modest. Beautiful in its sincerity. "She draws pictures," Daniel said. "Leaves notes. Tells Emma about school. About her mom. About me." Sophie nodded solemnly. "I tell her when I'm scared," she said softly. Miss Emma listens. Margaret's breath broke. While she had mourned behind locked gates and marble walls, surrounded by staff and silence, this father and child had grieved in the open air, kneeling on cold ground, offering what little they had. Flowers they could barely afford. Time stolen from exhaustion. Love that asked for nothing in return. Margaret felt shame rise, sharp and unavoidable. She had believed her grief was singular, unmatched, unbearable. But it wasn't. It was shared. "I thought I was the only one who lost her," Margaret whispered. Daniel shook his head gently. "No, ma'am. We just lost her differently." The wind moved through the cemetery again, rustling the trees like a quiet prayer. Margaret saw it clearly now. While she had mourned in a mansion, protected from the world, Daniel and Sophie had mourned here. Together. Exposed. Faithful. And in that painful realization, something shifted. Her grief was no longer isolated. It was joined by gratitude, by love, by the undeniable truth that her daughter's life had reached far beyond blood and wealth. Emma hadn't belonged only to her. She had belonged to everyone she touched. Margaret didn't plan the invitation. It slipped out quietly, almost shyly. "Would you have dinner with me sometime?" Daniel froze, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. Sophie's eyes widened. That single meal changed everything. At the long dining table that had known only silence and formality, stories finally found a place to sit. Daniel spoke about Sophie's school. Sophie talked endlessly about drawings, about Bunny the rabbit, about how Miss Emma used to sing softly when she couldn't sleep. Margaret listened, really listened. And for the first time in years, laughter filled the empty rooms of her house. Gentle at first, then warm, then real. She began helping Sophie with schoolwork, sitting beside her at the kitchen table instead of across polished desks. She attended recitals, asked questions, learned. Quietly, Margaret set aside a future for Sophie, not as charity, not as guilt, But his legacy, Emma's legacy, Daniel, uncomfortable at first, found small ways to repay kindness. He fixed loose steps, repaired a broken gate, changed light bulbs Margaret had stopped noticing years ago. And without realizing it, he repaired something else too. The loneliness Margaret had wrapped herself in like armor slowly loosened its grip. One afternoon, as Margaret helped Sophie braid her hair, the little girl looked up and smiled. "Grandma Margaret?" she asked, testing the words like something precious. Margaret's hands froze, then trembled. Then she smiled through tears she didn't try to hide. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm here." Love returned to that house, not with grand gestures or careful plans, but unexpectedly, unplanned, undeniable. And in honoring the daughter she lost, Margaret found a family she never knew she needed. Standing together at the grave, Sophie placed one last drawing. Angels above, hands held below, all connected by a golden thread. Margaret finally understood. Her daughter never truly left. She lived on in a black driver's gratitude, a child's drawings, and a family born from kindness. Because wealth fades, grief heals, but love, real love, outlives us all. Sometimes in our darkest moments, grace arrives quietly, wearing a uniform, holding flowers, and reminding us we are never alone.